we have been asked in the past to follow, like, what's the price of regenerative corn? And we say, I have no idea because I don't know what regenerative is. I have to have a standard I can measure to. And so we simply don't cover it. We treat it as if it doesn't exist in a way because we can't, without a definition, we don't know what that means. And that's really hard to communicate that to a consumer. I mean, most consumers, even in the organic label, I'm not a farmer. I cannot tell you, when I go to farm field days, it's fascinating to me to listen to farmers talk amongst themselves and talk about, grazing techniques and warm season grasses and cool season grasses. And I'm a layperson. I don't know this stuff. And as a consumer, it's really hard to convey that to a consumer. Like, what's the best technique for managing your grazing for your cattle? Most consumers are not going to know. Nobody has the time to get that deep into the details, but farmers know. And so maybe regenerative shouldn't be a consumer-facing label ever. Maybe it should always be a conversation between, let's say, farmers and the buyers, the first point of sale. And maybe that's the way to, rather than trying to get a lot of marketing value out of it, maybe it should just evolve into a standard that businesses work with amongst themselves.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops that are grown in healthy soils and organic livestock that is raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from Kellee James, founder of Mercaris, a data research company that tracks sales, pricing, and market conditions for organic commodity crops. Kellee sat down with Dave Chapman last summer to talk through the changes in the organic market in response to grain fraud, the COVID pandemic, and the rise of regenerative agriculture and USDA incentives for climate smart funding.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. And my guest today is Kellee James. Kellee is the founder and CEO of Mercaris, and she's going to explain what that means. So welcome, Kellee.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's great. So tell me, what is Mercaris and why did you start it?
Sure. So Mercaris is a company I founded, and we're 10 years old now. And our mission is pretty simple. The idea is to provide really good market data and analysis for organic crops and commodities. And it's the sort of thing that you're used to having at your fingertips in any other part of the economy. Things like, what are objective third-party prices for, organic corn or wheat, or, how much acreage of, organic soybeans was planted this year versus last year, or how much organic, did we import any organic oats and how much and where did it come from? So these are sort of basic macroeconomic fundamentals that up until Mercaris were only available sporadically, or sometimes that type of data wasn't available at all. And our job is to make sure everybody from, small family farms all the way up to, big organic companies have access to that information so they can use that to make better decisions for their own businesses.
So you chose to look at the organic market. Was that entirely an economic opportunity, or was that also part of a social mission for you?
Well, to me, the two are intertwined. And I have always thought, I've been fascinated watching, even this predates Mercaris, watching prices in the organic sector. I think it's a very powerful statement that, let's say, a bushel of organic corn costs more generally, almost always, than a bushel of conventional corn. And the reason is because there's just different types of production. They're totally different production systems. And when you take into account, organic isn't perfect as a label, but the fact that it requires biodiversity and soil health practices and, all the things that go with that, like rotational crops and whatnot, that is giving, it's an attribute. We say in society that we value soil health. But when you see the price of organic corn and as being higher than conventional corn, what that does is it puts a financial value, a dollar value to what we say we all want, which is cleaner air, cleaner water, better soil health, better farm worker health. And so I think those types of metrics are really important to communicate. So we chose to follow organic because I think it's one of the best ways of communicating, of translating those environmental performance metrics into something that is kind of universally understood, which is, financial.
Yeah. God, there's so many places we could go from there. So let's start with the fact that I think over half of the organic corn is imported into America that is sold, and I don't know, maybe a third of the soybeans.
It's actually about, those numbers have shifted a bit. About a third of organic corn is coming from outside of the US, whether it's Canada or overseas. Only a little comes from Canada. And for soybeans, it's much greater. Some close to 80% of our organic soybeans comes from outside of the US. We don't always have them here.
So why is that, given that we are one of the great grain exporting countries of the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that various people have tried to tackle, especially the past couple of years when we've realized, is it sustainable to be shipping things across the ocean? It makes you vulnerable to all sorts of, external forces. So there are a lot of reasons. I mean, organic is a harder system of production to do. I mean, it's not paint by numbers. You really got to be a scientist. You've got to be, an experimenter, and an entrepreneur. And so for the farmer who is maybe average age of the U.S. farmer is closing on 60 years old, do you really want to learn a whole new system of production now? It's a hill to climb. And, marketing it is more difficult. You can't take your organic soybeans just to the local elevator. Well, you might be able to, but probably you have to figure out how you're going to market it. You can't just grow corn on corn or corn soybean rotation. You're going to have to, incorporate some alfalfa or some oats or some other small grains in there. And so if you're used to just marketing corn and beans, now you've got to figure out what to do with your rotation. So there's a whole host of questions that the farmer has to be able to answer in order to grow organic. And that's difficult. And I only touched on a few of them. There's other things that have to be addressed too, but just to give everyone a sense of the decision-making that has to go on.
Yeah. Well, I get it that it's not easy, but it's not easy if you're in Ukraine either, or Turkey, or all the interesting places that this grain's coming from. One of the things that we've seen is a lot of fraudulently certified grains coming in. Also in the US, there have been some doozies.
Yeah.
Do you think that that continues? 80% of the soy is coming from the rest of the world. Where is it mostly coming from?
In the case of soybeans and soybean meal, it's mostly coming from India. Now, look, anytime human beings are involved in any system, you will find fraud at some point. It's just something about us. But I will say, without getting into out of my wheelhouse into grain inspections, which is a whole nother story, there is good organic grain coming from overseas. It doesn't necessarily mean it's fraudulent just because it's coming from overseas. And the factors that I just mentioned that are difficult in the US are sometimes easier overseas. So for example, here you have to fight, it's a dog fight because GMOs are so prevalent. So if you're growing corn, organic corn, and your neighbor's growing GMO corn, now you got to worry about contamination. It's difficult. It's a difficult, it just adds a layer of difficulty. Whereas in some of those countries that we mentioned, GMO corn is not a thing or as much of a thing. And so that's one less, worry. Or in parts of India where chemical pesticides and fertilizers have not made so much of an inroads, the transition is a little bit easier. So there are some countries that are starting from a different place. You could call it like organic by neglect in some ways, but the point is they're not having to battle through, trying to understand what their neighbors are doing and having to overcome, let's say, contamination issues or heavy pesticide reliance to start with. So that's one. And then the second thing is for something like soybean meal in the US, this has changed a little because everything is, we're in the middle of a commodity super cycle. But we have the old saying is you crush for meal, soybean meal, and you get oil. You got to figure out what to do with this oil. That goes double for organic. We've always had a market for organic soybean meal. Animals eat it. We have not always had a market for organic soybean oil. So if you crush a bunch of organic soybeans in the US, you've got to figure out what to do with the oil, which you may not be able to get historically. You may have not gotten an organic premium for, and now you've got to dump it or sell it for, at a loss or something. Whereas if you can crush it over in India, they can use the oil for cooking oil and whatnot, and you just pay for what you want, which is the meal. So that's another economic consideration that contributes to why we do less of it in this country.
Okay. I know this isn't really what we came to talk about, but I'm curious. Do you think that, I've read about the fraud in the Washington Post and the grain imports, and Peter Worski covered it pretty extensively for a number of articles. And the articles were incendiary enough that Congress actually voted millions of dollars to try and lock down the fraud. But I don't think that money's actually been spent yet. So we haven't seen a real change in the system. Do you think, or is this a concern for your customers or your American vendors about an unlevel playing field? Or is that just, if everyone says, if it's certified by the USDA, it's good enough for me?
Well, so I think, look, trust in organic is the currency we have. I mean, that if you don't have trust from consumers, you have nothing. So I think it's to everybody's benefit and enlightened self-interest, from the farmer all the way, to the retailer, to invest in systems that, find fraud, root it out, close loopholes. And again, I'm not a government, person. So I can't speak precisely to how dollars were spent or what have you, but I do know I sit on the board of the Organic Trade Association, and I do know there are a number of initiatives that have taken place, are underway to address, fraud, closing loopholes like historically brokers, grain brokers that never, quote, owned the grain didn't have to get a certification. Well, now they do. So trying to understand where the weak points were and address those, as well as the things that are less about legislation and more about best practices and raising standards, that we all, kind of, adhere to or can adhere to. And so I know, for example, there's been a long running, organic task force, organic grain task force under OTA, which is there to address fraud and sharing best practices, but also lobbying and keeping pressure on USDA to make sure those loopholes are closed and that bad actors are caught and dealt with. So I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm an optimist by nature. I think Peter Worski did as painful as it was to read those articles, he did everyone a great service by doing that, because you can't ignore it. And once you know that it's, if it's happening, you've got to address it head on rather than hiding from it. So I'm hopeful, even though I can't speak precisely to how every single dollar was, spent on addressing fraud.
I don't think they've spent them yet. So we're hoping that they will. They move at a glacial speed there at the USDA.
Yeah, well, there's a farm bill coming up. So I would encourage, the action I would say is, get involved and engaged, whatever organization you're part of, whether you're part of OTA or you're part of a group of farmers, or, this is the time to make your voice heard, because the farm bill is, right around the corner. So
yeah. Well, Congress actually did give the money. It just hasn't been spent.
Okay.
They're still working about no, we have this great integrity program coming, but I don't think that they've stopped any ships. I don't think that they've decertified anybody and sent the grain back. So,
I can't speak to that. I don't know. But I think, the other thing is, if you sign up for I know that, the after Peter's article, it's not like the folks that were getting caught got stopped. There was a big, that huge case of the farmer, I'm forgetting his name, that was not in, this was not overseas. This was right here in the Midwest. And
Gary Constant.
Yeah, the guy who ended up committing suicide actually was busted. Yeah.
And there was another one too. But they're never busted by the National Organic Program. It's always like tax fraud or even the big shipment of grain. That was because they were bringing in crack corn, but crack corn wasn't allowed for some reason. And then it turned out that, hey, your paperwork is so flaky, that this grain started as conventional and ends as organic.
Well, look, Al Capone was busted for, why he wasn't busted for murder and all those other things. But
tax evasion.
They used tax evasion. So, by any means necessary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. What is the annual sales growth of organic grains?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple of ways of looking at this. So first of all, overall prices have gone up, over the past year and plus. And so sometimes you can say, well, the value of all organic grain has gone up. Has that been because there's been more grain produced, or is it because the same amount of grain is more expensive? In the case of organic, both things are happening. So we have seen, Mercaris publishes twice a year, we publish updates on our organic harvested acreage. We get numbers, we work directly with organic certifiers, we keep everything anonymous. They never tell us, Farmer Smith planted, 150 acres. Instead, we aggregate that information. And we say to them, and we're able to say, here's how many acres were harvested for organic corn, total. And by that measure, organic acreage for row crops, and I'm speaking just of row crops, I don't have as much data on fruits and vegetables, although we do track that, but our wheelhouse is row crops and organic dairy. So overall, organic row crop acreage has increased 3% this year. The long-term trend is it's always been increasing. It always goes up, several percentage points a year. And within that, there are micro trends. So organic soybeans, which have seen enormous price increases. Organic soybeans for feed have gone from $19 a bushel about 18 months ago to they touched a high of mid 40s, $44 a bushel. They've fallen back down to the mid 30s. But acreage for organic soybeans is up 18% from last year. Meanwhile, corn is down by 1%. So the various crops are, up or down, but the overall trend is more land is planted into organic acreage each year.
So a farmer probably shifted some of their soy production to corn production because the price was looking so good.
Yeah, corn to soybean.
That's right. Corn to soy. Yeah, right.
That's okay. Right.
One of the things that I was listening to you talking today at a farmers conference, and it was interesting. You're talking about the explosion of organic sales due to COVID, and you were saying one of the reasons you said is, well, people weren't going to restaurants, so they're going and buying their food. I thought that was so interesting, Kellee. So when people went to the store, they paid the extra money for organic, but when they were going to the restaurant, they didn't have the choice and they weren't getting organic. Do you think I'm reading that right?
I think so. I mean, if you think about where you get your organic food, there are a few farm to table type restaurants, but when you go to school, you think of these places that just move a lot of food. Just your chain restaurants, your Chili's and whatnot, your fast food restaurants, your Arby's, your hospitals and schools and whatnot. They don't tend to have any organic options at all. So if you're eating outside the home, your options for organic are very, fairly limited. Your options come in the grocery store for the most part. And when COVID hit and everything shut down, we pulled kids out of school. We were all, if we could, we were working from home. That means, you go to the grocery store and you just, people were what they call pantry loading. They were buying up everything, not just organic SKUs, but every SKU at the grocery store was going up. We saw empty shelves. And so organic benefited from that, unprecedented event, and sales went way up. And then as things opened up and we went back to school and work and whatnot, or some of us did, you had more options. And so organic sales, the good part of the story is that organic sales have not fallen. They have in fact continued to rise. So we had a step change up in 2020. And then we didn't have another step change. So 2021, 2022, we didn't continue to see a 13% increase, but we didn't see a fall. In fact, we saw, a 2, 3, 4%, depending on the category you're looking at, increase. So we are ahead year over year of where we would have expected to be had there not been a COVID event.
Yeah. It was amazing to me to see how quickly something that seemed so hard to change changed. I mean, we saw so many things in COVID. Suddenly, nobody was flying anywhere.
Yeah.
And, as a result, we were actually meeting our Kyoto Accord targets that year because there was so much less fuel being burned. But also, people's diets genuinely changed. And as you say, they became much more organically based.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And all it took, I mean, it's not all, it was a humongous shift in our world. And yet what happened was essentially voluntary.
Yeah. 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 I mean, and I know I still, even though restaurants are open, I go out far less frequently. I've just discovered like I enjoy cooking, and I'm not baking quite as much sourdough bread as I was at the beginning, but I still am now a regular baker, which I wasn't before the pandemic. It's shifted some of my habits.
Yeah. Yeah. For me too. Yeah. Let me ask you, okay, yeah, I have to go into this area. So you used to work in carbon markets, right? On the Chicago Carbon Exchange. So could you, as if I were a child, just explain to me what that means?
Oh, sure. So yes, I'm one of the OGs of the carbon markets back in the early 2000s. So this was problem of climate change, hasn't gone anywhere. We were talking about it 30 years ago. It's just now there's more urgency around it. But we decided to use, this is where markets meet environmental performance. So if you want to get rid of lower carbon emissions, there's a few ways to do it. You can just regulate everyone and say, you're not allowed to produce, and you're not allowed to burn as much fossil fuel. You can't produce as much carbon. And then chaos usually ensues, because what are you going to do in the very short term? If you burn diesel, it's not like you can usually switch over overnight. So instead, I was with a company called the Chicago Climate Exchange. It used a concept that is actually not new. It's called a cap and trade system. We did this in the 80s. So in the 1980s, George Bush, the first George Bush, under the Clean Air Act, regulated sulfur emissions. If you lived in the Northeast in the 60s and 70s, you had an acid rain problem. You burn coal, goes up, mixes in the atmosphere, comes down as rain that's acidic and kills your forests. So rather than just say you can't burn any sulfur anymore, they said, we're going to set a nationwide, a regional limit on how much sulfur can go up in the atmosphere. You got to measure it at the stack, and it's, let's say, 100 tons this year. And next year, it's going to be 99 tons. And next year, the year after that, you can only emit 98, and it stair steps down. So it's a glide path to where you need to be for whatever your version of environmental sustainability is. In the meantime, to meet that 99 tons, that cut, you can do one of two things. You can either invest in cleaner coal technology, burn different fuel, which has a cost to it, or so that you only emit 99 tons, or you can let somebody else do that and you can buy an offset from them. So you're still emitting 100 tons and you buy 1 ton of sulfur offset, and that's how you turn it in, and that's how you get your 99 tons. And what that does is it means that whoever can do it at the least cost is incentivized to do it first. So like maybe, Dave, you have a brand new coal-fired power plant that has got all the new technology, and you're like, great, we can do this cheaper. And maybe I have an old coal-fired technology, and it's going to take me a little longer to get to, and a higher investment. I shouldn't move first. You should, because you can do it cheaper, and that's better for everybody, the environment and the consumers. So you go beyond. You're like, I can only emit 99 tons too, but I'm going to go 2 over. I'm going to emit 98. And I have 1 to sell you, and I have 1 so that I make my target. And we trade that carbon. I buy the carbon from you. You get paid for what you're for doing the right thing. I have a penalty that I have to pay for that carbon, but the planet wins because everybody's stair stepping down overall. That's cap and trade. We did it for sulfur, and it worked. We don't have an acid rain program, and nobody's business went kablooey. And so we enacted a version of that for carbon. It was a voluntary market because there was no legislation, federal or otherwise, requiring that. But we had about 200 companies sign up for this program, and we gave them limits each year that stair step down, and they traded carbon to meet those limits. And it was really quite a success in a microcosm way. Now, what we were hoping was that sort of little laboratory would give the US Congress courage to do it countrywide, and that didn't happen. So the whole market unwound in around 2009. The US Congress said, we're not going to do a cap and trade. And so the whole thing unwound, and it's been dormant, very quiet for the last 10 years after that. And finally, we're getting back to discussions about limiting carbon, which let's talk about that, because I'm of the opinion that we're not doing it quite the right way, but that's another story. But cap and trade is an environmental market. It's the finance. It's just like with Mercaris. It's tracking and reporting a financial incentive to do the thing that has the most environmental benefit.
And you think it did work?
It did work in that limited experiment, that pilot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it worked for sulfur. It's worked in other environmental markets.
Sulfur was mandated by Congress and had to be.
Right.
So the proof of concept is there.
Right. Exactly.
At the moment, we lack the political will.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think about that because I'm sure you've seen the $2.8 billion that the USDA has just given for climate smart agriculture.
Yeah.
And I thought, geez, climate smart agriculture. I think Monsanto invented that term.
Yeah.
That makes me feel a little willy already. I'm like, oh God, is this really it? I have a list that somebody just gave to me of the companies that were the big winners in the 2.8 billion.
Man, let's hear it.
Cargill, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Target, JBS Processing, Syngenta, ButcherBox, Campbell Soup, Hershey, Land O'Lakes, Nestle, Walmart, Kellogg's, Danone, Tyson, Bayer, McDonald's, Purina, Purdue, Costco, Frito-Lay, Nestle, Mars, and Unilever.
Yeah.
It's kind of a rogues gallery.
Yeah, well, and I'm reminded of like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And when I look at it, sometimes I'm like, this looks exactly like the regular stock market. What is the difference? So I will say, here is my issue with the current, I don't know, call it version 2.0 of these carbon markets. 15 years ago, we said it's got to be an economy-wide cap. So there was a place for ag. My role at the Chicago Climate Exchange, one of my roles was I worked with farmers who were adopting low-till, no-till, rotational grazing, and storing carbon, measuring it, and then we're getting credits. However, it wasn't all just candy. Like, it all just wasn't incentive. There was a stick there, and the stick was you have to make cuts. The industrial folks have to make cuts. So if you're a manufacturer like Unilever or an energy company like Duke Energy or DuPont, you had to reduce, you had reductions to make. And it was hard because, I think that's one of the reasons why it failed, was because at the end of the day, it's like, hey, there's some medicine here. We're going to offer a little bit of a chaser. Carbon markets are going to offer a little bit of an escape valve or a glide path. But at the end of the day, somebody somewhere has to reduce their emissions. It can't just all be incentive, all carrot and no stick. And it didn't pass. Everyone, it was too much political opposition. So then we came back now, this version, and said, it's really hard to get people to commit to reducing, emissions no matter what, and potentially have to pay money to do it. So I tell you what, let's just offer ag incentives to store carbon, pay them for it, and hope for the best. That's the problem I have now, is that it's very one-sided. It's very supply side. It's very, ag will store carbon, we'll pay folks to do it. Companies that maybe you wouldn't expect are getting involved, but I'm not seeing a parallel commitment to reduction of emissions. Some companies are. I will say this, on the individual level, there are companies that are saying we are actually reducing our emissions. We're investing in renewable energy. We're investing in, retrofitting facilities and whatnot. So I don't want to paint it with a broad brush, but largely this climate smart commodities is saying, if we throw money at ag can sequester our carbon, and that is going to, fix the climate problem. And I just don't think it will.
Yeah, I don't think it will either. Yeah. But I'm especially concerned that we're giving so much money. Well, this takes us to regenerative agriculture and a conversation about that. Regenerative as a term is basically the same group of climate smart corporations have embraced regenerative. Syngenta, Cargill, Bayer, Monsanto, they all love this term, and they've all committed that we are going to be regenerative within 10 years or 15 years. And it reminds me of of the battle that we have in organic, for real organic, but it's much worse because there is no definition anywhere.
Yeah.
So what's your experience of this public conversation about regenerative agriculture?
Well, and the other thing it makes you sound like a Grinch if you're like, no, regenerative, who you gotta live motherhood and apple pie, right? Like who doesn't love, regenerative? So what I will say is this. I think now is the time to double down on organic standards. And I think, taking within organic, we have a little bit of a debate going on, which is, the organic standards have not evolved very quickly. It's been, 20 plus years and there hasn't been a real evolution of what the organic label means. And I think now is the time to maybe, invest in that. I know there's like the Chow Act and a few other things that are so close right now to being, to being law. And I think that will be good for organic. I also am a believer in, I know this is a little bit controversial, but things like what Rodale is spearheading with the regenerative organic, which is the analogy I use is it's like a chassis of a car that you can build on top of. Take your organic standard, that's the chassis. You have to start somewhere with some actual verifiable standards that are transparent and built with input from lots of stakeholders and enforceable. And then if the government standards aren't evolving quickly enough, I mean, still put energy into making sure those government standards are as tight or as rigorous or as good as possible. But then you can add on things like, organic was never perfect. It never addressed things like farm worker, fairness. It never addressed some of the other more precise animal welfare standards. Add those on top, and you have your regenerative organic standard, and you can absolutely grow to that standard, produce to that standard, source to that standard. I think that's also a viable path forward. I think I'm from the improv school of both and. Have organic, make it as strong as you can, and add on to it. Now, we have been asked in the past to follow, like, what's the price of regenerative corn? And we say, I have no idea because I don't know what regenerative is. I have to have a standard I can measure to. And so we simply don't cover it. We treat it as if it doesn't exist in a way because we can't, without a definition, we don't know what that means. And that's really hard to communicate that to a consumer. I mean, most consumers, even in the organic label, I'm not a farmer. I cannot tell you, when I go to farm field days, it's fascinating to me to listen to farmers talk amongst themselves and talk about, grazing techniques and warm season grasses and cool season grasses. And I'm a layperson. I don't know this stuff. And as a consumer, it's really hard to convey that to a consumer. Like, what's the best technique for managing your grazing for your cattle? Most consumers are not going to know. Nobody has the time to get that deep into the details, but farmers know. And so maybe regenerative shouldn't be a consumer-facing label ever. Maybe it should always be a conversation between, let's say, farmers and the buyers, the first point of sale. And maybe that's the way to, rather than trying to get a lot of marketing value out of it, maybe it should just evolve into a standard that businesses work with amongst themselves. That's my sort of one,
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. That's what the regenerative movement was when it moved from Bob Rodale out to the Midwestern farmers. And they were really not intending it as a consumer-facing label. They were intending it as how we farm is different, and it's smarter, and it uses less inputs, and it actually embraces many of the principles of organic farming without that dreaded O word, because they're from the Midwest. They didn't like us coastal people. But that's a really interesting distinction. And what's happened is it has been basically, occupied by brands, big brands coming in and liking that term. I have to say one thing. The Real Organic Project is a great deal like Regenerative Organic Certification. We also use USDA as a basis. We also have an add-on group of standards. Actually, our standards, as they turn out, are very similar. They didn't start similar, but Rodale has moved, Rock has moved much closer to our standards, not the other way around. So, because at first they were like no-till, and all of our farmers said, well, we don't believe no-till is right. It's really based on herbicide, right? Yeah. So the one big difference between us and Rock is they have 90 farmers and we have 1,100 farmers. So
yeah. I mean, that's one thing I really liked about organic is the, sometimes you start talking about dollars and cents, and what it misses is the community, and it misses, the shared values. And you can write laws till you're blue in the face, but it's the sort of intent and the spirit that it's hard to write into a document. And so I've appreciated being able to kind of immerse myself. And I think more like new and incoming entrepreneurs need a way to connect with folks like you, folks like David Lively,
Yeah.
who I love because he gives you perspective. He gives me perspective.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
Yeah. I was not a great fan of the USDA taking over organic standards and certification, but I'm not sure I was right. Obviously it's gone askew, terribly askew, and we need to correct it one way or the other. But when I look at regenerative, and something Michael Sly once said to me, he said, for fair trade, we didn't have the government involved because we didn't want that kind of corruption, loss of power, but it hasn't gone well for us.
No.
Fair Trade USA, they look exactly the same. They're very different. And everyone is very confused. So it's hard to stop greenwashing no matter what you do. So I like that there's a legal definition, even though we just lost a lawsuit against the USDA for not following their legal definition. It's not a bulletproof vest, but it is a lot more of a foundation than not having that.
Yeah.
It gives you something that you can orient to. Another difference is organic is very much a worldwide movement and well established. There are, I think, 2 million organic farmers around the world, and most of them are very small farms in the Southern Hemisphere. And I was just talking with somebody from the European Parliament about what we do. I said, does this matter to you that we're doing such a bad job in the US? And she said, very much. This is not good. This is not good. And they're trying to decide whether they're even going to give reciprocity to the USDA organic certification.
Yeah.
For the European certification. Right now they do, but it's not a given that will continue.
Yeah. Well, this is again a reason to get our house in order, so to speak. And I would think that would speak to everyone from, small farmers who, want to make sure that they have access to markets overseas, if that's what they want, small, medium farmers, all the way to companies who are, multinationals. And it reminds me of like the car manufacturer dilemma, where our cars were so inefficient that, China was like, you can't sell us cars. You gotta, we don't want that over here. Yeah. So I'm in favor of finding the places where there's kind of a convergence of interest, which is not easy. But in this case, like, why would you not want to have, global? Why would you not want to be able to work with Europeans? That's,
Yeah, no. And actually their organic agriculture is very sophisticated and very developed. They have many of the same problems as us, but they just haven't lost nearly as big as we have.
Yeah.
Hydroponics is completely outlawed in the EU. They do not have CAFOs that I know of, that are being certified. Whereas for us, it's the norm. Mm-hmm. It's the majority of our milk. It's the vast majority of our eggs are coming from operations that would not be certified in the EU.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is interesting, but not what I meant to talk about. Let's just take a look here. So one of the things that when you and I talked before, you talked about why is it so hard to scale organic and keep it good? And, how do we create a system of capitalism with a heart? I love that.
Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts about that you could share? We got to talk about it, but I'd like to share it with a bigger audience.
Yeah, well, I will say, if it makes anyone feel any better, it's not a problem unique to ag, right? Like everything, I could produce energy for my home using a bicycle sustainably, for my own household, probably, a certain amount. The minute I try and produce energy for my block or my city or my state or my country, it leaves a mark. And so the same problem with any system of production when you're trying to produce for the masses, it's hard. It's not easy. So I don't want anyone to feel like agriculture has been singled out or is the only one struggling with this. Scale is really difficult to achieve in a sustainable way. And yet, we have to figure it out. It's like an existential problem. I think some of it is not, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think, I love the field of ecosystem services. I wish we put more energy, effort, money, time into it, because when I buy, I don't know, when I buy some lumber to build a house, all I'm getting is the price of the board feet for lumber. I'm not, within that price is not captured the fact that this tree came from a forest that was protecting coastline from storm surge. Like that, we just don't even measure it. I'm completely lost in the equation. And yet that's part of the value of the tree, or that it's producing, oxygen. Or here's one that's made the news a lot. If you cut down that tree and now you don't have tree cover in that neighborhood, or where that, is now, more vulnerable to rising temperatures, none of that is captured in the price of board feet. And that's the same thing for most of the food we buy. We're only getting a very one-sided, one-note view. Whenever I read like traditional ag publications, man, the obsession with yield is incredible to me. Like, farmers are winning awards for producing 250 bushels of corn an acre, which to me seems insane. Like that's like a yield trap, so you're producing 250 bushels of corn. That's great. Some fisher person downstream is harvesting fewer fish because, a bunch of nitrogen is going into, his or her waterway, and it's, causing, algae growth and killing the fish. So it's just not, we have not made it a priority to understand, measure, and communicate the multiple system-wide benefits and problems that anything, produces. So I think the first step is to rigorously, accurately measure those, report those, and then incorporate that into the trade, into our buying and selling in our supply chains. And if we were able to do that, now you can make choices and trade-offs and say, yeah, I want the corn, but I really don't want to kill the oysters. I love oysters. They're delicious. I don't want to kill off the oysters. And so should I be buying this or should I not?
Kellee, do you think it's naive or, I make a living. I make a living growing tomatoes, and I understand a small business and the realities of it. I go back to small is beautiful. And I think, gosh, when I see small local systems working, they seem to actually somehow at least take in some of the secondary effects of how things are produced. Mm-hmm. And it becomes an issue for my community. And if I'm doing something that's pouring crap into the river, the people in the community actually are unhappy about it. And we get that feedback loop. One of the examples I love is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire 100 years ago in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And a lot of people died because it was a death trap. The factory, they were making shirtwaists. Fabric is something that people wore. And when the journalists took pictures of that, the whole country erupted. And that was the beginning of OSHA. That was the beginning of a more successful union movement. That was the beginning of real reform in terms of worker safety. The same terrible conditions are happening now in Sri Lanka, which is now where all of our clothing is made, in places like that. But we don't react to it because we don't see it.
Yeah.
It's so far away. It's sort of like guilt-free, terrible consequences, but we don't relate to it as being people who are living in this way.
Yeah.
We don't see it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, moving things, making sure that there's local, and I think a totally different industry, but I was reading an article about how, all these hollowed out Midwestern towns where there was manufacturing, like executives and this like ridiculous where corporate executives are making 400 times the salary of the average worker, that it's very rare now for executives to live in the same communities where their means of production are. So it's maybe a different version of what you just pointed out, which is you don't have to see or deal with the consequences because you're not even there. So I agree that, moving things local, I think it also makes it more resilient now. I mean, this past couple of years, I mean, every time, unfortunately, every time I start to learn a little bit more about some area, I think, gosh, now how am I going to sleep at night? I didn't realize everything was hanging by a thread. I mean, the fact that when we just had that railroad strike just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the economists at USDA was like, you realize we have about 7 days of supply. If the railroads shut down, if we can't transport things vast distances, we got about a week till we're facing severe shortages of nearly everything. Well, localized, regionalized production might, help some of that. When the hurricane hit Puerto Rico 5 years ago, and I became an instant expert and didn't realize all of our hospital saline is produced in Puerto Rico. It's produced in one place. And so the hospitals are like, how are we going to get saline? I was like, well, who did that? Who put one single, the entire country's saline supply in one location so far away? It just, to me, it maybe gained some efficiencies. And again, back to that, like that single metric. If your single metric is saving 3 cents, per whatever unit, then that makes sense. But if your metric takes into account climate resilience and, local economies, and then maybe if you're able to incorporate that as a metric of success, you don't put everything in one place, far away. So I don't know.
Yeah. Building a resilient system means a more localized system.
Yeah.
It's all, I mean, meat is pretty consolidated. I think in America,
yeah,
I don't know, it's like 80% of the meat comes from 4 companies.
Yeah, it's processed. Like there's this huge bottleneck, right? Like there's a bunch of producers. Maybe not with chicken. Chicken is that's maybe I'll put the broilers aside for a second, but like, let's just take like cattle. I mean, there's a lot of independent cattle, raising cows. And then it all converges on like 4 different, JBS, Cargill, Smithfield, there's only like 4 companies that process that meat, but the production of it is actually quite, dispersed.
Yeah. Okay. Good difference. Yeah. Another idea from Michael Pollan. I love throwing these out, see what other people say. Talking about monopoly, and he has a wonderful discussion about Sherman antitrust, and the other antitrust laws and acts were not about protecting consumers from high prices. They were about protecting citizens from a consolidation of power and a denigration of democracy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely. I can't speak to the origins of the law, but yeah, I mean, it's protecting us in so many ways. Consolidation of power that turns into, can you buy a politician and make your will, impose your will? It also impedes on the ability of us all to, my nightmare is like one day everybody works for either Amazon, Apple, Google, or the sort of choice and free will and whatnot. And I don't see. I think monopolies are only good in very specific contexts, and maybe not even those anymore. And like, so for example, one example of monopolies that we all live under is utilities. I don't have endless choice for my power. I live in Maryland. My power provider is Pepco. Those were monopolies that were granted because in the old days with, you had one huge coal-fired power plant. It was inefficient to have, 50 small coal-fired power plants. But that's even changing. I'm not even sure there's a good case with that, with all the renewable energy that's coming on and the ability to do microgrids. And now we've seen failures, when you have climate events and you are dependent on a lone utility. So I think even that is changing. But that, I'm struggling to come up with examples where a monopoly maybe, I'm struggling to come up with examples of monopoly as like just an unqualified good thing. There's always drawbacks that come with it.
Yeah, that's right. It is interesting to see as we evolve in trying to find stability in things like energy systems, they start to look more and more like organic farms, building on diversity and not just on production. There are many other values that are very important to us.
Yeah. That's right.
So before we go, we should talk about diversity in farmers. Mm-hmm. Right. You and I have talked about that, but again, I'd like to bring this conversation to a bigger audience. You had asked, how do we build an equitable food system when only 2% of the land is owned by people of color. Did I get that number right?
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right. 98% of this country's farmland is held by white farmers, white landowners.
Yeah. So can you give a challenge there?
Yeah, well, listen, to kind of maybe bring this full circle, it's sort of funny to have the conversation about regenerative ag because it's like this new trendy thing. Meanwhile, talk to indigenous farmers who are like, yeah, welcome to the, crop rotation is not new. Like we were farming under crop rotations for thousands of years, but thank you for giving it a name and telling us how to farm. So yes, I think the loss of a lot of us probably listening to this are organic farmers. Organic farmers already understand why biodiversity is important. Why would we not value that same type of diversity when it comes to who owns the means of production, who works, who derives wealth from that. So diversity is an imperative. We won't survive without it. We need diversity. We would have been maybe a farther ahead of the curve in terms of sustainability if we had diverse farming voices and practices included all along. We wouldn't have to rediscover things like crop rotation or controlled burning, or all the things that farmers of color have done, as just part of their system for years. So I think it's necessary. And then in this country, we have a particular history of just brutality. I mean, it didn't just accidentally happen that only 2% farmers of color. I mean, genocide was committed and enslavement was committed, and that's how we got to where we are today. There are policy fixes that are being suggested, but we're fighting the sort of old or still new, still current prejudices that we are part of our history. So the USDA actually did have a remedy where they were trying to forgive debt for farmers of color. And what happened, it got stopped in its tracks when a group of white farmers sued because it's not enough money that USDA shovels money out the door in the form of any type of subsidy or insurance you can think of. The very fact that a black farmer or an indigenous farmer might have gotten a little bit of money to help overcome centuries of discrimination was enough to raise hackles, and that group of farmers chose to sue, and it stopped the program. So the remedies are out there, but just like with climate change, do we have the political will, and can we get out of our own way to see these solutions through?
Yeah. You want to make a call out about freedmen heirs?
I would love to. So my own small contribution, everybody do what they can, is I helped found a group called the Freedmen Heirs Foundation, FREEDMEN, heirs, HEIRS. So it was named after the Freedmen Act, which was just after the Civil War. This was the 40 acres and a mule that black farmers were going to get that were formerly enslaved. And that was also a program that was stopped. It only lasted for a few years before President Jackson killed it. And so there was never any sort of restitution or recompensation given to enslaved black folks at scale, anyway, that would have helped them get a new start. And so Freedmen Heirs was named intentionally to say, we want to see that promise kept. And our goal is to support black farmers, whether that is getting new farmers into, new people into farming, black folks who would like to farm but just haven't had the opportunity, and making sure they have access to capital, access to training, extension services, markets, or whether it's working with existing black farmers that want to make their farming operations better. So we have a number of programs, both some aimed right at the farmers, some aimed at the buyers, to connect them with growers who need all sorts of support, and can also provide them with all sorts of new and interesting products for their shelves, for their businesses. So it's early days yet. It's only about a little over a year old, but stay tuned, and please reach out if you'd like to get involved. I'll leave my contact information with you, Dave. Maybe there's an easy way to get it.
Yeah, we can post it on the podcast.
Yes.
So,
okay.
Thank you, Kellee. Before we end, is there anything you'd like to say? Any important thing that I didn't ask, or just something that you'd like to say?
Well, I will say this. I sometimes I think, look, agriculture is cool. Like we need, just like for a while it was really cool for young folks to go into finance, or now it's cool for them to go into coding and technology. Ag is cool. I mean, ag has technology, ag has finance. And so I did not grow up in an ag family, and I found my way to ag. And will say I have found it to be the most rewarding, very welcoming. Ag is a community of people, and there's all types of people in a community. But I will say that I have met the smartest, most innovative folks in ag, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that and has the opportunity I have had. So part of that is meeting folks like you, Dave. No one's like you, but getting to have these conversations. And I hope that even though if I'm not there, able to be there physically, that I get to have more of these conversations. So please, I meant that, reach out, and I would love to talk.
Great. Kellee James, thank you very much for talking today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you'll subscribe and share the link with your friends. Please take the time today to leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to so that others can find us. A video version of this interview is found at realorganicproject.org and by following our YouTube channel. Please join us next time when our guest will be Stefan Rees, the CEO of Naturland, a long-running European food label that is an add-on certification to organic around the globe.